New this morning, text messages obtained by CNN reveal that a key figure in the plot to overturn the 2020 election briefed White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows about his attempts to gain access to voting machines in battleground states.
These are texts between Meadows and this guy named Phil Waldron. Waldron was really behind some of the most outlandish proposals for overturning the election, and they really focused on getting access to voting machines in particular, right? And he was really hung up on this idea that foreign countries, foreign adversaries had hacked into voting machines through outlandish ways.
Based on nothing.
Based on nothing, satellites, thermostats, and he was on a mission to prove it. And so this shows that Mark Meadows was talking to Phil Waldron, a direct line to Trump's chief of staff, at a time when Trump's closest allies were really hunting and really urgently hunting for proof, any proof or evidence of voter fraud that they never really did turn up.
Recently unearthed text messages reveal that the White House was directly involved in a plot to gain access to voting machines in Arizona and Georgia following the 2020 presidential election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. I'm Yasmin Khan with the Rebel HQ, and the Arizona plot was referred to as the, quote, lead domino that would trigger the cascade of similar efforts taking place in other battleground states. The operative, Phil Waldron, texted Mark Meadows, Trump's White House chief of staff, that an Arizona judge had overturned a lawsuit filed by GOP members. The lawsuit attempted to demand that state election officials submit voting machines and election equipment as evidence of the alleged voter fraud Trump and the GOP had been claiming was taking place. And this all happened in December of 2020, the period between the November election and the January insurrection. In response to the judge dismissing the lawsuit, Meadows said it was, quote, pathetic. Pathetic for who, though? Waldron and Meadows have both been subpoenaed by the January 6th committee, and these text messages were part of a batch of records that Meadows turned over. Waldron has yet to comply with the subpoena and has instead engaged the committee in a legal battle over his cell phone data. Waldron, a retired Army colonel, has been an integral part of the GOP's coup attempt, despite efforts by the GOP to distance themselves from him. However, text messages between Waldron and Meadows, a high-level Trump official, show that Waldron was more heavily involved in the effort to overturn the 2020 election than previously known. The messages, along with messages between Meadows and Ginny Thomas, also prove that Meadows himself was more directly involved in the plot than he would rather people believe. In addition to Waldron keeping Meadows in the loop in regards to seizing voting machines, CNN reports that he also put together a 38-page PowerPoint presentation detailing options for how the GOP could effectively overturn a presidential election. The document was literally titled Election Fraud, Foreign Interference, and Options for 6 Jan.
This PowerPoint dated January 5th, it is beyond insane.
38-page PowerPoint.
This PowerPoint presentation.
A PowerPoint briefing titled Election Fraud, Foreign Interference, and Options for 6 Gen.
We've been hearing a lot about the PowerPoint, although some of the reporting's only just come into view, and it's a PowerPoint plot to stage a coup to end democracy in America and install Trump as an authoritarian leader without an election to back it up. It is that serious.
January 6th committee chairman Benny Thompson said of the presentation and Waldron, quote, the document he reportedly provided to administration officials and members of Congress is an alarming blueprint for overturning a nationwide election. The select committee needs to hear from him about all these activities. Additionally, Waldron was directly involved in drafting 2 executive orders that were meant to instruct the Department of Homeland Security and the Pentagon to seize voting machines. Trump never signed the orders because he thought it would be too risky to do so, but the drafted orders were submitted by the National Archives to the Select Committee earlier this year. Waldron worked closely with former Trump advisor Michael Flynn while the two served together in the military, and according to a former U.S. official sourced by CNN, he's been wary of foreign hacking of U.S. voting machines for a while, and, quote, Waldron has been chasing election machines for years. This made him an ideal fit to lead the effort to seize voting machines and voting data during the 2020 election, especially since Trump and his team had been pushing unfounded claims of voter fraud for months leading up to the election. And as we know from the January 6 hearings, those claims were debunked by members of Trump's own team repeatedly, both before and after the election. Now, in stories like this one, there's often a debate around culpability. Did so-and-so know that they were breaking the law when they broke the law? Did they actually believe their own lies? Of course, that debate can be seen as a matter of privilege because for most Americans, it doesn't matter whether or not you knew what you were doing. If you broke the law, you broke the law, and you're expected to suffer the consequences for doing so. A recent and obvious example that comes to mind is the Texas woman who was sentenced to 5 years in prison for casting a provisional ballot on the advice of an election worker without realizing that she was ineligible to do so. Now, according to reporting from the Texas Tribune, the Texas court ruled that it was, quote, irrelevant to the prosecution whether or not the defendant knew she was ineligible to vote. So these stories and these debates can get tedious because, for one, they're open to much more public scrutiny than ever before because of social media. And on top of that, it seems there is a different set of rules for different sects of society. And even when standing upon those shaky grounds, there are other factors that contribute to whether or not someone is punished for the crimes they commit. Fear of public backlash, for example, fear of upsetting other members of society or government, personal biases surrounding ideas of whether or not the crime was being committed for the greater good, etc. It's tedious because damaging and illegal information is so blatantly unapologetic and so clearly indicated and so dripping with deliberation that half of us are pulling our hair out asking why we're having these debates at all over things that are so obvious. And the other half are doing impressive mental acrobatics to justify their own stubborn and misguided prejudices and agendas. I'll remind you that the PowerPoint document was entitled Election Fraud, Foreign Interference, and Options for 6 Jan. So should it matter whether or not Waldron believed that he was doing the right thing because he was convinced that foreign governments were hacking our voting machines? Should it matter whether or not Mark Meadows believed in the big lie or that he was working on behalf of Jesus or whoever? That is, of course, a reference to a text exchange between Meadows and Ginny Thomas where Meadows said, quote, "This is a fight of good versus evil. Evil always looks like the victor until the King of Kings triumphs. Do not grow weary in well-doing. The fight continues." Now, should it matter whether or not these operatives were entirely brainwashed or delusional while they spent months, if not years, plotting to overthrow an entire government in a coordinated effort? It's clear they knew what they were doing, and it's clear that they had their own reasons for doing all of it. These debates are exhausting, and I'd really like for us to just accept the evidence, accept the testimonies, and accept the facts, and move on. All right, that is it for me. Please like and subscribe if you got something out of this content, and be sure to follow me over on Instagram and TikTok. Thank you.